I can see there's something timeless in the way a horse moves, the rhythm of hooves against earth, that ancient percussion that has echoed through human history for thousands upon thousands of years. And tonight I find myself thinking about that sound, about the journeys it accompanied, about the civilizations it shaped, and the quiet partnership between human beings and these powerful, graceful creatures who carried us forward through time. There is something almost dreamlike about imagining the very first moments, those early encounters on the grasslands of prehistory, when wild horses ran free across endless plains, their manes flowing like dark water, their eyes bright and wary, and somewhere in that vast expanse of grass and sky, human beings watched them, studied their movements, learned their patterns, and began to wonder what might be possible. But the domestication of the horse did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded gradually, like dawn spreading across a landscape, somewhere around 4000 BCE, perhaps on the steppes of what we now call Kazakhstan, or in the grasslands stretching across Central Asia. Nomadic peoples began the slow work of taming, of building trust, of transforming a relationship from predator and prey into something far more complex, something that would alter the course of human civilization in ways no one could have foreseen. I imagine those early horse keepers watching the herds, approaching slowly, offering handfuls of grain, speaking in low, steady voices, learning which animals might tolerate a human presence, which might even seek it out, and over generations, over centuries, the wild creatures became companions, became partners in survival, their strength merging with human ingenuity to create possibilities that had never existed before. At first, these early domesticated horses were likely used for meat and milk, resources that sustained communities through harsh seasons. But somewhere in that deepening relationship, someone realized that a horse could carry weight, could pull loads, could transform the very nature of human movement across the land. And with that realization, everything changed. The invention of the wheel, occurring around the same period in human history, 3500 BCE or thereabouts, created new possibilities that seemed almost magical. When combined with the strength of horses, suddenly, heavy loads that would have required dozens of people to move could be transported by a single animal pulling a simple cart. Trade routes that had been limited by what a person could carry on their back expanded exponentially. Villages that had been isolated by distance could connect, exchange goods, share knowledge, intermarry, and build networks that spanned hundreds of miles. I think about the first wheeled vehicles pulled by horses. How crude they must have been. Solid wooden wheels, rough axles, simple harnesses made from rope and leather, creaking and swaying along dirt paths that were barely more than animal trails, and yet how revolutionary they must have seemed. How they must have expanded the horizons of everyone who witnessed them, opened up possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, across the ancient world, horses and wheeled vehicles appeared and transformed societies. The chariot emerged as both a tool of war and a symbol of power, light, fast, deadly in battle, carrying archers and spear throwers into conflict with a mobility that infantry could never match, and equally important for the movement of goods, for the connection of distant cities, for the administration of growing empires that stretched across landscapes too vast for foot travel alone. But tonight, my thoughts turn not toward war, but toward the quieter uses, the daily rhythms, the merchant with a cart full of pottery, making the journey from workshop to market, the farmer bringing grain to the miller, the family traveling to visit relatives in a neighboring valley, the slow, steady transformation of distance from an insurmountable barrier into something manageable, something that could be crossed in a day or a week or a season with the help of these patient, powerful animals. And so the centuries passed and the partnership deepened, and horses became woven into the fabric of human civilization in ways both grand and humble, carrying messages across empires, pulling plows through fields, bearing riders on journeys of exploration and discovery. But it was in the realm of transportation, of movement, of the daily work of connecting one place to another, that horses truly transformed the human world. In ancient Rome, the roads stretched out like stone rivers, connecting cities and provinces in a network of commerce and administration that had never been seen before. And along those roads, horses pulled carriages and wagons, merchant carts loaded with wine and olive oil and grain, official vehicles carrying tax collectors and magistrates and military dispatches, the clip-clop of hooves on paving stones becoming the soundtrack of an empire, the rhythm of civilization itself. The Romans understood something fundamental about horse-drawn transportation. They understood infrastructure. They built roads that could accommodate wheeled vehicles with proper drainage and solid foundations and relatively smooth surfaces. They established way stations where horses could be changed and travelers could find rest and food. They created a system, a network, that allowed goods and people to move with a reliability that previous civilizations had never achieved. The cursus publicus, the Roman postal system, operated with remarkable efficiency. Relay stations positioned at intervals of 15 to 20 miles, fresh horses waiting, riders carrying messages that could travel up to 50 miles in a single day, sometimes more under urgent circumstances, transforming communication from something that moved at walking pace into something approaching the speed of a galloping horse, collapsing time and distance in ways that must have seemed almost supernatural to those who remembered the days before. But Rome was not alone in this revolution. Across the ancient world, civilizations were discovering the possibilities inherent in horse-drawn transportation. In China, the Han Dynasty developed its own networks of roads and postal relay systems, horses pulling elegant carriages with silk canopies, merchants guiding caravans along the early routes that would eventually become the Silk Road, connecting east and west through thousands of miles of desert and mountain passes. The Silk Road itself, that legendary network of trade routes, existed because of horses, pack animals, yes, but also the wagons and carts that could carry far heavier loads than any animal bearing weight on its back. Caravans stretching for miles, hundreds of horses and camels and oxen, moving silk and spices and precious stones and ideas across continents at a pace measured in months and years, but moving nonetheless, connecting civilizations that would otherwise have remained isolated, unknown to each other. I think about the drivers of those ancient wagons, the skill required to manage a team of horses over rough terrain, to navigate mountain passes where a single misstep could send an entire cart tumbling down a cliff face, to ford rivers where the current ran strong and the bottom was uncertain, to judge the weather and the condition of the animals and the state of the roads, to make the thousand small decisions that meant the difference between a successful journey and disaster. The harness itself, the equipment that connected horse to vehicle, evolved slowly over centuries. Early harnesses were often inefficient, pressing against the horse's throat in ways that restricted breathing and limited the weight they could pull. But gradually, through trial and error, through careful observation of what worked and what didn't, harness makers developed the horse collar, a padded ring that rested on the shoulders rather than the neck, distributing weight more effectively, allowing horses to pull far heavier loads without choking, without exhausting themselves so quickly. This innovation, which appeared in China around the 5th century CE and spread gradually westward, reaching Europe by the 9th century, transformed the economics of transportation. Suddenly, a single horse could do the work that had previously required multiple animals. Farms could clear more land with horse-drawn plows. Mills could receive more grain. Cities could grow larger because food could be transported more efficiently from the surrounding countryside. In medieval Europe, the horse-drawn cart became essential to daily life. Farmers hauling produce to market, merchants transporting goods between towns, nobles traveling in covered carriages, pilgrims journeying to distant shrines, and always the roads, those muddy, rutted, often barely passable tracks that connected the scattered settlements of the feudal world, where a journey of 30 miles might take an entire day, where rain could make travel impossible for weeks at a time, where rivers had to be forded or crossed on ferries, where every journey was an undertaking that required planning and provisions and a certain amount of courage. The vehicles themselves varied enormously, from simple two-wheeled carts that a farmer might build himself with local timber and iron fittings, to elaborate coaches commissioned by wealthy merchants and aristocrats, with springs and cushions and painted panels depicting scenes from mythology or family heraldry. Some vehicles were designed for speed, light and streamlined, drawn by spirited horses that could cover ground quickly on good roads. Others were built for capacity. Heavy wagons with thick wheels and reinforced axles, pulled by draft horses. Those massive, patient animals bred specifically for strength rather than speed, the draft horse, the great working breeds, Percherons and Clydesdales and Shires, developed over centuries of selective breeding, each generation choosing the largest, strongest, most even-tempered animals, until horses emerged that stood 18 hands high at the shoulder, weighing more than a ton, capable of pulling loads that seemed impossible, their hooves the size of dinner plates, their muscles rippling beneath coats that gleamed with good health and proper care. These giants of the horse world became the engines of commerce, pulling brewery wagons loaded with barrels of beer, hauling coal from mines to cities, moving building materials to construction sites, drawing omnibuses that carried dozens of passengers through city streets, their steady, plodding gait covering mile after mile, day after day, with a reliability that made them invaluable to the growing economies of medieval and early modern Europe. But alongside the heavy draft breeds, there were also lighter horses, carriage horses and coach horses, animals bred for stamina and a smooth gait, for the ability to trot for hours without tiring, pulling passenger vehicles at speeds of 8 or 10 miles per hour on good roads, transforming travel from an ordeal into something approaching comfort, at least for those who could afford the fare. The coaching inns, those establishments that sprang up along major routes, became centers of community life, places where travelers could find a meal and a bed, where horses could be changed and vehicles repaired, where news and gossip were exchanged, where the great and small of society mingled in the common room, united by the shared experience of the road, of movement across the landscape at speeds that earlier generations would have considered remarkable. By the 17th century, regular stagecoach services began to appear in Europe, scheduled routes connecting major cities, vehicles leaving at set times and arriving on predetermined days. Assuming the weather cooperated and the roads were passable and no wheels broke and the horses remained healthy, it was the beginning of something like mass transportation, the democratization of travel, where a person of modest means could purchase a ticket and journey to distant places that would previously have been accessible only to the wealthy or the exceptionally determined. The stagecoach era, which would reach its peak in the 18th and early 19th centuries, represented the culmination of thousands of years of development, the perfection of horse-drawn transportation technology, coaches built by master craftsmen, horses bred and trained for specific roles, routes mapped and maintained, inns and stables positioned at strategic intervals, driver and guards who knew every mile of their routes, every steep hill and sharp curve and dangerous ford, who could manage a team of 6 horses at a gallop, who could keep to a schedule that passengers and merchants and mail contractors depended upon. In England, the mail coaches became legendary, painted in maroon and black, carrying the royal insignia, given right-of-way on all roads, guards armed against highwaymen, post horns announcing their approach, sweeping through villages and towns at speeds approaching 10 or 11 miles per hour, a pace that must have seemed breathtaking to observers who were accustomed to the slower rhythms of farm wagons and local transport. The drivers, those skilled professionals who managed the reins, who knew each horse by temperament and capability, who could judge distances and conditions with an accuracy born of long experience, became figures of respect, almost of romance. Their many caped coats and low-crowned hats, their ability to thread a coach through narrow gates and around tight corners to bring a team to a halt precisely at the inn door, to coax tired horses through the last miles of a long stage. They were artists of a kind, practitioners of a craft that had been developing for millennia, and everywhere horses pulled vehicles, whether in the great cities of Europe or the expanding frontiers of the Americas or the ancient routes of Asia, the sound was the same, hooves striking earth or stone or wood, the jingle of harness, the creak of leather and wood and iron, the low commands of drivers, the snorting breath of animals working, moving, carrying humanity forward into the future, 1 mile at a time, one journey at a time, building the networks of commerce and communication that would shape the modern world. The 19th century arrived, and with it came the golden age of horse-drawn transportation, a period when the technology reached its absolute zenith, when cities filled with the sound of thousands upon thousands of hooves, when the streets became rivers of traffic, flowing endlessly through daylight and darkness, carrying the lifeblood of industrial civilization. In London, in New York, in Paris and Berlin and Vienna, the scale of horse-drawn transportation grew to proportions that would have seemed incomprehensible to earlier generations. Tens of thousands of horses working in a single city, pulling hansom cabs and private carriages, omnibuses carrying dozens of passengers along fixed routes, delivery wagons for every conceivable type of goods, fire engines racing to blazes, hearses carrying the dead to their final rest, construction wagons hauling bricks and timber and iron, brewery drays loaded with barrels, coal carts bringing fuel to homes and businesses. The infrastructure required to support this army of working horses was extraordinary. Vast stables built throughout the cities, multi-story buildings housing hundreds of animals, with ramps leading to upper floors, with haylofts and grain storage, with farrier shops and harness rooms, with the constant activity of grooms and stable hands, feeding and watering and grooming, mucking out stalls and laying fresh bedding, an entire hidden workforce supporting the visible transportation system. Each morning, before dawn, the stables would come alive, thousands of horses being harnessed, backed into their assigned vehicles, led out into the awakening streets, drivers climbing to their seats, checking reins and brakes, beginning the day's work that might not end until darkness fell again. And some horses worked through the night, pulling night soil carts that emptied the cesspits of the city, or carrying late travelers, or hauling goods to markets that opened before sunrise. The omnibus, that remarkable invention, transformed urban life in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from our current vantage point. Before omnibuses, a person's world was limited to the distance they could walk, perhaps a mile or two from their home. But with omnibuses running regular routes, workers could live further from their employment. Families could visit relatives across the city. The radius of daily life expanded dramatically. A typical omnibus might be pulled by 2 or 3 horses, sturdy animals capable of stopping and starting repeatedly, of managing the constant load of passengers boarding and alighting. The vehicles themselves were surprisingly large, seating 20 or more people inside and on the roof, swaying and jolting over cobblestone streets, the horses leaning into their collars, straining up hills, given their heads on downward slopes, the driver managing the reins with practiced skill, calling out stops, watching traffic, judging gaps, weaving through the endless flow of other vehicles. And there were so many other vehicles, private carriages of the wealthy, elegant broughams and landaus with liveried coachmen, their horses groomed to perfection, their harnesses polished and gleaming, moving through the same streets as working wagons, creating a strange democracy of traffic where a duchess might be delayed by a coal cart, where everyone was subject to the same congestion, the same limitations of speed and space. The hansom cab, that icon of Victorian urban life, offered a faster alternative for those who could afford it. A light 2-wheeled carriage pulled by a single horse, designed for speed and maneuverability. The driver perched high at the back, the passenger enclosed in a small compartment. These vehicles could dart through traffic, cut around slower wagons, deliver their fares quickly to appointments and destinations across the city. The cab horses were often spirited animals, lighter than draft horses, but strong enough for long days of steady work. In New York City, by the 1870s and 80s, horse cars ran on rails set into the street surface, creating a smoother ride than the omnibus, allowing horses to pull heavier loads more efficiently. The rails guided the vehicle, reducing the skill required to steer, allowing the horses to focus purely on pulling. These systems expanded rapidly, tracks spreading throughout the city, connecting neighborhoods and commercial districts, carrying millions of passengers each year. The horses that powered these systems, they lived hard lives, working 10 or 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, breathing the dust and smoke of industrial cities, navigating streets that were often poorly maintained, slippery when wet, treacherous in winter ice and snow. The average working life of a city horse was perhaps 4 or 5 years before injury or exhaustion or illness ended their service. And yet, there was also great care taken by responsible owners. Horses were valuable, representing significant investments. A good draft horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a working man, and so they were fed well, stabled properly, given veterinary care when needed, fitted with shoes by skilled farriers who understood the biomechanics of the hoof. The relationship between horse and handler was often one of mutual respect, of partnership, even affection. The farrier's craft was essential. The rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot iron meeting water, the smell of burning hoof as a shoe was fitted. Each horse needed new shoes every few weeks, the iron wearing down on hard pavement, the hooves growing constantly, requiring trimming and balancing. A lame horse was a horse that couldn't work, and so the farrier's skill was valued, sought after, essential to the entire system of urban transportation. Beyond the cities, horse-drawn transportation continued to evolve. Stage lines in America crossed vast distances, connecting the eastern settlements with the expanding frontier. Mail contracts drove the development of faster coaches, lighter construction, better suspension. The Concord coach, built in New Hampshire, became famous for its quality and durability, its distinctive thorough-brace suspension, leather straps that allowed the body to rock and sway, absorbing the worst of the jolts and bumps, protecting passengers and cargo. These coaches traveled routes of hundreds or even thousands of miles through wilderness and across prairies, fording streams and climbing mountain passes. The Butterfield Overland Mail, which operated from 1858 to 1861, ran from Missouri to California, 2,800 miles, with stations every 20 miles or so where horses could be changed. The journey took roughly 24 days, if all went well, if weather cooperated and horses stayed healthy, and wheels didn't break and axles didn't snap. Passengers endured dust and heat and cold, cramped conditions and minimal sleep, but they crossed a continent in less than a month, a journey that would have taken 6 months by wagon train, the Pony Express, though it operated for only 18 months, captured the imagination like few other horse-drawn enterprises, riders galloping across the western territories, changing horses every 10 or 15 miles, carrying mail from Missouri to California in 10 days, young men riding day and night through storms and heat, past hostile territory and dangerous terrain. The romance of it obscured the reality, which was exhausting and dangerous work, but it demonstrated what was possible, how horse-drawn transportation at its absolute limit could compress distance and time. In Australia, the Cobb and Coburg coaches created a transportation network across the vast interior. Horses bred for stamina, for tolerance of heat and drought, pulling coaches over roads that were often barely more than tracks, through landscapes where settlements were separated by days of travel, where water was scarce and temperatures extreme. The drivers were legendary figures, their knowledge of country and conditions, their ability to manage teams of 5 or 6 horses, to keep to schedules despite all obstacles in South America, in Africa, in India, wherever humans had settled and built civilizations, horses pulled vehicles adapted to local conditions and needs, water carriers in hot climates, timber haulers in forested regions, passenger vehicles navigating mountain roads that seemed almost impassable. The technology of horse-drawn transportation proved remarkably flexible, capable of serving almost any need, any environment, any purpose. The vehicles themselves became increasingly specialized. Milk wagons designed for early morning deliveries, with racks holding dozens of bottles, bread wagons with compartments to keep loaves clean and fresh, ice wagons insulated to slow melting, moving throughout cities in the days before refrigeration, hearses elaborately decorated with black horses in black plumes, slow processionals marking the passage from life to death, prison vans called Black Marias, heavily built with barred windows, transporting the accused to court and the convicted to jail. Fire engines represented the cutting edge of horse-drawn technology. Speed was essential. Seconds could mean the difference between a small fire and a conflagration. Fire horses were trained to respond instantly to alarms, racing from their stalls, backing into position, standing still while harness was thrown over them and buckled, then launching into a gallop, racing through streets, pedestrians and other vehicles scattering, the thunder of hooves and the clang of bells announcing their approach. These horses became local celebrities, known by name, admired for their courage and speed. The harness room in a fire station was a place of careful preparation. Everything hung in precise order, designed to be grabbed in darkness, to be fastened in seconds. The horses knew their work, could navigate familiar routes without guidance, would pull until they collapsed. Such was their training and their loyalty. Fires were fought on their backs, pumps powered by human muscle, while horses waited, steaming, sides heaving, ready to move again at a moment's notice. Agricultural use of horses reached its peak in this same era. Mechanical reapers and binders, plows and cultivators, all pulled by horses. Farms grew larger. Prairie soils were broken. Wheat and corn production expanded, feeding the growing industrial cities. A single farmer with a team of horses and the right equipment could cultivate hundreds of acres, produce harvests that would have been impossible in earlier times. The horse became the engine of agricultural revolution, making possible the surplus that supported urban growth and industrial development. The harvest machines moved through fields of grain, horses pulling the mechanical reapers that cut and bundled, transforming weeks of hand labor into days of mechanized efficiency. And yet, even as horses reached this peak of utility, even as their numbers in cities and on farms climbed to unprecedented heights, the seeds of change had already been planted, technologies emerging that would eventually transform everything once again. The steam engine, which had revolutionized rail transportation in the mid-19th century, began to appear in other forms. Traction engines that could pull plows and threshers, steam-powered omnibuses that experimented with urban routes. But these early mechanical alternatives were expensive, complicated, often unreliable. They required specialized knowledge to operate and maintain. They needed coal or wood for fuel, water for boiling. They were dirty and noisy and frightening to other horses on the road. And so horses continued to dominate, their technology refined over millennia, their infrastructure in place, their economics well understood. A horse could be purchased relatively cheaply, could be fed on hay and oats that could be grown locally, could be maintained by knowledge that was widespread and accessible, could reproduce itself, creating the next generation of working animals. The investment in horses, in stables and harness and vehicles, was so vast that change could not happen quickly, even when alternatives began to appear. But appear they did. The internal combustion engine, developed in the late 19th century, compact and powerful in ways that steam could never match. The first automobiles, strange contraptions that appeared in the 1890s, expensive toys for the wealthy, unreliable and often breaking down, but improving with each passing year, each new model growing slightly more dependable, slightly more practical. The transition was not immediate, not dramatic. For 2 decades, 3 decades, horses and motor vehicles shared the streets, the sounds of hooves mingling with the puttering of engines, the smell of manure mixing with the smell of gasoline and oil. In cities, the change came first. Motor trucks proving their worth for heavy hauling, delivery vans replacing horse-drawn wagons, taxis powered by engines rather than oats competing with hansom cabs for fares. The First World War accelerated the transition in unexpected ways. Millions of horses were requisitioned for military use, pulled artillery, carried supplies, moved troops, and died in extraordinary numbers in the mud of Flanders and the Eastern Front. The mechanized warfare that emerged from that conflict demonstrated the potential of trucks and tractors, their ability to operate in conditions that would kill horses, their capacity to work continuously without rest or fodder. And when the war ended, when soldiers returned home, they brought with them experience with motors and machines, knowledge that spread rapidly through civilian life. In the 1920s, the balance shifted decisively. Model T Fords rolling off assembly lines by the millions, affordable to middle-class families, trucks becoming standard equipment for businesses, tractors appearing on farms in rapidly increasing numbers. The economics changed. The initial cost of a motor vehicle was higher than a horse, but the operating costs proved lower. No need for stables or grooms, no daily feeding, no farrier visits, just gasoline and occasional maintenance. And the vehicles could work longer hours, could travel faster, could carry heavier loads with less labor. The great stables began to empty. Thousands of horses sold, sent to farms where they might find lighter work, or slaughtered, their population in cities declining precipitously, from tens of thousands to hundreds. The sound of the city changed, the clop of hooves giving way to the rumble of engines. The smell changed, exhaust replacing the organic scent of horses and their manure. The streets themselves changed, paved with asphalt instead of cobblestones, no longer needing the texture that gave horses purchase, optimized instead for rubber tires. In rural areas, the transition took longer. A farmer might keep his horses for years after tractors became available, attached to animals he had worked with for decades, trusting their reliability, understanding their needs and capabilities. But eventually, economics won out. A tractor could plow more acres in a day, could work through heat that would exhaust a horse, could operate by headlight through the night during critical planting or harvesting windows. Farms mechanized, horses retired. The working breeds that had been so carefully developed over centuries found their purpose disappearing. By the 1940s, by the end of the Second World War, horse-drawn transportation had become a rarity in developed nations, a curiosity, something that drew attention when it appeared. The milk wagon pulled by a horse was charming, but archaic. The farmer still using horses was seen as old-fashioned, behind the times. The knowledge that had been so essential, the skills of driving and harnessing and managing teams, began to fade, passed from commonplace competence to specialized expertise, maintained by fewer and fewer practitioners. And yet, horses did not disappear entirely. They found new roles, new purposes, recreation and sport, pleasure, riding and showing. Racing had always been popular and continued, polo and fox hunting, dressage and jumping. The relationship between humans and horses persisted, transformed but not ended, from working partners to companions, from engines of commerce to objects of affection and sport. In some places, pockets of horse-drawn transportation survived. Tourist areas where the clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones was valued for its atmosphere, its connection to the past. Carriage rides in Central Park or through historic districts. Amish communities where religious conviction maintained older technologies, where horses still pulled buggies and farm equipment, where the skills and knowledge were preserved not as museum pieces but as living practice. The brewery horses, particularly in Britain, maintained a presence as advertising and tradition, shires pulling drays at special events, their massive forms and flowing feather, their patient temperament, drawing crowds who had never seen working horses except in pictures, a connection to a past that was rapidly receding, becoming memory, becoming history. I think about what was lost in that transition, not just the horses themselves, though their absence from daily life represented an enormous change, but the entire culture that had grown up around them, the ostlers and coachmen, the harness makers and wheelwrights, the blacksmiths whose forges had rung in every town and village, the stable hands who knew each horse by name and temperament, the drivers who had navigated city streets with skill born of years of practice. All of that knowledge, all of those relationships, fading away within a single generation. The streets became faster, more efficient, capable of moving more goods and people over greater distances in less time. But something was lost too, a certain pace, a certain rhythm, the living presence of animals in daily life. The reminder that transportation was a partnership between human and beast, requiring care and consideration, not simply a machine that ran on fuel and responded to mechanical controls. And yet, I find myself thinking tonight not about loss, but about the extraordinary arc of the story, the thousands of years when horses and humans worked together, shaped each other, built civilizations through that partnership, from the first tentative domestication on the steppes of Central Asia, through the chariots of ancient empires, the postal systems of Rome and China, the coaching inns of early modern Europe, the great urban stables of the industrial age, to the final decades when motor vehicles gradually replaced them. It was a relationship that spanned millennia, that touched every aspect of human life, that made possible trade and communication, exploration and conquest, the daily movement of goods and people that built the complex societies we inherited. And though the working horses are mostly gone from our streets, though their role in transportation has ended, The echoes of their hooves still resonate through history, through the roads they traveled, the cities they served, the civilizations they helped create. The harness hangs in museums now, the great stables converted to other uses or demolished, the skills maintained by enthusiasts and historical societies. But for thousands of years, the sound of a horse pulling a cart or carriage was the sound of progress, of connection, of human civilization moving forward, and that legacy persists even now, even in our mechanized age, in the roads we travel, in the patterns of our cities, in the very concept of transportation as something that connects, that enables, that transforms distance from barrier into possibility. The story of horse-drawn transportation is, in many ways, a story about time itself, about the human perception of distance and possibility, about how the speed at which we can move shapes the very structure of our societies, our relationships, our sense of what is near and what is far, what is possible and what is impossible. Before horses, the world was measured in footsteps. In the distance, a person could walk in a day, perhaps 15 or 20 miles on good terrain, with favorable conditions. Settlements were isolated. News traveled slowly. Wars could be fought and finished before distant regions even learned they had begun. The rhythm of life was entirely local, bound to the immediate landscape, to the people within walking distance. Horses changed the scale of everything. Suddenly, a day's journey might cover 50 miles, 100 if the need was urgent and the horses were changed frequently. News that would have taken weeks to spread could arrive in days. Armies could mobilize and move with unprecedented speed. Empires could be administered across distances that would have been unmanageable before. The world contracted, or perhaps expanded, depending on one's perspective. What had been impossibly far became merely distant. What had been distant became accessible. And this transformation happened slowly enough, gradually enough, that each generation experienced it as the natural order of things. A person born in 1700 knew a world of stagecoaches and mail carriers, of roads and inns, and the steady improvement of vehicles and harness. They did not think of themselves as living through a revolution, yet they were just as their ancestors had been, just as their descendants would be, each generation pushing a little further, moving a little faster, connecting a little more extensively. The ecology of the thing fascinates me too. The way horse-drawn transportation created entire systems, entire webs of interdependence, the farmer growing hay and oats, the blacksmith forging shoes and hardware, the harness maker stitching leather, the stable keeper providing shelter and care, the coach builder crafting vehicles, the innkeeper offering rest and refreshment, the farrier maintaining hooves, the veterinarian treating illness and injury. All of these professions, all of these skills, existing because horses pulled vehicles, because humans had learned to harness their strength for transportation. Cities were shaped by horses in ways both obvious and subtle. The width of streets, designed to allow vehicles to pass each other, the location of water troughs, the placement of stables, the development of parks where horses could graze, even the architecture of buildings, with arched entrances large enough for vehicles, with courtyards where carriages could turn, with separate entrances for service wagons. The physical fabric of urban space bore the imprint of horse-drawn transportation, and still does, even now, even though the horses are gone. The manure was its own ecosystem. Hundreds of pounds per horse per day Multiply that by tens of thousands of animals in a large city, and you have a waste management challenge that occupied considerable attention, but also a resource collected and sold to farmers, to gardeners, returned to the land to nourish the crops that would feed the horses that produced more manure. A circular system, organic, renewable in ways that petroleum-based transportation could never be. There was something deeply sustainable about the whole arrangement. Horses ate grass and grain, plants that grew from soil and sun and rain. Their waste returned to the earth. Their bodies, when their working life ended, could feed other animals. Nothing was lost, nothing wasted. The energy that powered the entire system came from the sun, captured by plants, consumed by horses, converted to motion, to work, to the movement of goods and people across landscapes. And I think about the individual relationships, the bonds between humans and the horses they worked with daily. A carter who drove the same team for years, who knew their personalities, their quirks, who could sense when one was slightly off, developing lameness or illness, who spoke to them as partners, as colleagues in the day's work. There was an intimacy to it, a mutual dependence that is absent from our relationship with motor vehicles, however useful they may be. The motor vehicle is a tool, a machine. It responds to controls. It has no personality, no preferences, no good days or bad days. It does not need encouragement on a steep hill or gentle handling when tired. And this is efficient. This is modern. This is progress by any practical measure. But something was lost in that exchange. Some quality of relationship, some recognition of transportation as a partnership rather than a command. Perhaps this is why horses persist in our imaginations, why they appear so often in stories and films set in the past, why the sound of hooves still carries such emotional resonance. They represent not just a different technology, but a different way of being in the world, a different relationship with time and distance and the labor required to move through space. The great long-distance coaches racing across continents, horses changed every few miles, fresh teams taking up the traces, pulling through day and night, through storms and heat, the passengers enduring discomfort and exhaustion, all to save days on a journey, all to compress time, to arrive sooner, to conduct business, to see loved ones, to carry news that could not wait. There was something heroic in it, something that speaks to fundamental human desires, to overcome limitation, to transcend the restrictions of geography and time. And now, in our age of instant communication, of air travel and high-speed rail, of transportation that moves at speeds those 19th century passengers could barely have imagined, we have lost something of that heroism, or perhaps we have simply relocated it. The journey itself is no longer the achievement, no longer the story worth telling. We focus instead on the destination, on what we do when we arrive. The travel is merely transit, merely the boring interlude between meaningful moments, but for thousands of years, the journey was the story, the adventure, the test of skill and endurance and luck. Whether crossing the Silk Road or simply traveling from one village to the next, movement through space was meaningful, was difficult, required planning and preparation and courage, and horses were the partners in that endeavor, the enablers of human ambition, the living engines that made everything possible. I find myself returning to that image, that sound, hooves on earth, on stone, on wood, the rhythm that accompanied human civilization for so long, the percussion of progress, of connection, of daily life unfolding at the pace of a horse's gait, not the frantic speed of our current moment, but something steadier, something more measured, something that allowed for observation, for conversation during the journey, for the landscape to unfold gradually, revealing itself mile by mile, hour by hour. There is a meditation in that pace, a kind of mindfulness, though they would not have called it that, the necessity of moving at the speed an animal can sustain, of working with living creatures rather than against them, of understanding that some distances simply require time, cannot be rushed beyond a certain point, that there are limits built into the very nature of things, and that accepting those limits, working within them, is not defeat, but wisdom. And so the circle closes, and the story that began in prehistoric grasslands, with wild horses running free and humans watching, learning, beginning to imagine a partnership, that story reaches forward across millennia, through empires and epochs, through technological refinement and cultural transformation, until it arrives at a moment of transition, a handing off of responsibility, from living muscle to mechanical engine, from organic to industrial, from the old world to the new. The last working horses in most cities disappeared in the middle of the 20th century. Within living memory, there are people alive today who remember the sound, who rode in horse-drawn vehicles as children, who can speak from direct experience of a world we now encounter only in museums and historical recreations, and with them, when they are gone, will go the last direct connection to thousands of years of human history, to the long partnership that shaped our world so profoundly. But the legacy remains in the roads that still connect our cities, in the patterns of a settlement that horses made possible, in the very concept of public transportation, of scheduled service, of the democratization of movement. All of this grew from the foundation of horse-drawn vehicles, from the slow accumulation of knowledge and skill and infrastructure over centuries. And even though the technology has changed, even though the sounds and smells are different, the underlying purpose persists. The human need to move, to connect, to overcome distance, to bring together what geography would separate. And perhaps, on quiet nights, if you listen carefully, you can still hear them, the ghost horses, pulling their invisible loads through the darkness, the echo of all those millions of journeys, all those billions of miles traveled, all those partnerships between human and animal, all that patient labor that built the world we inherited, fading now into memory, into history, into stories told on nights like this, when the past feels very near, and the sound of hooves seems almost audible, just beyond the edge of hearing, carrying us gently, slowly, toward sleep, toward dreams, toward tomorrow. There is a world that exists just beyond the edge of what we think we know, a world that has been unfolding quietly for hundreds of millions of years, long before we arrived to give it names, long before we learned to look closely enough to see. It is a world of green things, of cells and chlorophyll, of roots reaching downward into darkness and leaves lifting upward toward light. A world that covers the surface of this planet in patterns so intricate and so vast that they shape the very air we breathe. Tonight, I find myself thinking about this world, about the silent architectures of plants, about the way a single seed contains within itself an entire future, waiting. The science of this world has a name, botany, from the ancient Greek word for grass or fodder. But the word feels too small for what it holds, too neat and contained for something that encompasses forests and ferns, mosses and mangroves, the towering redwoods and the smallest algae drifting in a drop of pond water. I imagine standing at the threshold of a greenhouse just after dusk, when the glass panels have fogged slightly with the moisture of 1,000 breathing leaves, when the light outside has faded to a deep indigo and the shapes inside become soft and dreamlike, half seen. The air would be thick, almost tangible, carrying the mineral scent of wet soil and the green perfume of living tissue, that particular smell that rises from stems when they're cut, from roots when they're lifted from the earth, a smell that is somehow ancient and immediate at once. In this threshold space, neither fully inside nor out, I think about what it means to study the lives of organisms that cannot move away, cannot speak, cannot do anything but grow and adapt and quietly persist, transforming sunlight into sugar, pulling nutrients from stone, breathing out oxygen in an exchange so fundamental that it makes all other life possible. The earliest humans who paid attention to plants were not called botanists. They were called survivors. They learned which roots would sustain them through winter, which leaves would heal a wound, which seeds could be stored and planted when the seasons turned. They learned by trial and error, by watching what the animals ate, by tasting and waiting to see what happened next. But there came a time when observation became something more, when people began to ask not just which plants were useful, but how they worked, why one plant grew in shade while another demanded sun, why some bloomed in spring and others waited until autumn, why a cutting from one plant could grow into an entirely new individual, identical to its parent. These questions opened doorways, and beyond those doorways lay gardens of knowledge that branched and branched again, leading in 1,000 directions toward taxonomy and physiology, toward ecology and genetics, toward understandings that would reshape how we see not just plants, but life itself. I think of the first person who looked at a flower and wondered about its purpose, who saw that the bright petals and the visiting insects were connected, that the dust on a bee's legs carried something essential from one blossom to another, that what looked like beauty was also function, strategy, survival coded into color and scent. I think of the first person who sliced a stem thin enough to see through, who placed it under a lens and discovered that what seemed solid was actually chambered, cellular, made of tiny rooms with walls and doors, conducting water upward, moving sugars downward, a hidden infrastructure as complex as any human city. And I think of how these discoveries built upon one another, slowly, over centuries, each generation handing the next a slightly clearer picture, a slightly deeper question. The greenhouse, I imagine, stands quiet now in the gathering dark, its inhabitants continuing their slow work of photosynthesis, of growth, of responding to signals we are only beginning to understand, signals carried in wavelengths of light, in chemical messengers that travel from root to shoot, in the subtle pull of gravity that tells a seed which way is up. In this moment between day and night, in this space where the human world pauses, the plant world continues its ancient rhythms, unfurling leaves that will capture tomorrow's light, extending roots that will find tomorrow's water, preparing flowers that will open according to schedules written into their very cells. And somewhere in the long history of botany, there are stories waiting, stories of people who devoted themselves to understanding this green world, who traveled to remote places seeking specimens, who filled notebooks with careful drawings, who asked questions that seemed simple but led to revelations, who built the foundations of a science that would eventually touch everything from medicine to agriculture, from ecology to evolution. These stories begin, as so many stories do, with curiosity, with someone who looked at a leaf and saw not just green, but mystery. The earliest attempts to understand plants were not written down. They lived in memory and practice, passed from one generation to the next in the knowledge of which bark would ease a fever, which berries would nourish, which roots could be ground into flour when other food grew scarce. But around 2,300 years ago, in the Mediterranean world, something began to shift. People started writing down what they observed, started trying to organize the bewildering diversity of plant life into categories that the mind could hold. There was a man named Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle's, who walked through the gardens and wild places of ancient Greece, noting the differences between trees and shrubs and herbs, observing how some plants had flowers and others did not, how some grew from seeds and others seemed to spring from the earth fully formed. He wrote 2 works that would survive the centuries: Enquiry into Plants and on the Causes of Plants. And in these texts, he tried to make sense of what he saw, grouping plants by their forms, by whether they were wild or cultivated, by the textures of their leaves and the patterns of their growth. Theophrastus noticed that some plants had hearts of wood, solid cores that made them strong and tall, while others remained soft and green throughout. He saw that certain plants needed moisture while others thrived in dry soil, that some bore flowers that became fruit while others produced only leaves. His observations were careful, detailed, but he worked without a lens, without the ability to see the hidden structures that would later explain so much. He could only describe what was visible to the naked eye, and try to find patterns in the overwhelming variety. For more than 1,000 years, his work remained the foundation. Other scholars added to it, corrected it, expanded it, but the fundamental approach stayed the same: observation and classification, the slow accumulation of facts about which plants existed and where they grew. In the 1st century were a Greek physician named Pedanius Dioscorides traveled with the Roman armies, and everywhere he went, he collected information about plants, particularly those with medicinal properties. He compiled this knowledge into a work called De Materia Medica, describing nearly 600 plants and their uses. This text became essential, copied and recopied through the medieval period, translated into Arabic and Latin and Persian, its pages illustrated with drawings that became more and more stylized with each reproduction, until sometimes the plants were barely recognizable, transformed into decorative symbols of themselves. Medieval monks grew plants in their monastery gardens, carefully tending herbs for healing and vegetables for sustenance. They copied ancient texts and sometimes added their own observations, but much of their work focused on the practical, on cultivation and use, rather than on understanding the fundamental nature of plant life. The plants themselves were seen as fixed, unchanging, each species a separate creation, perfect and complete. The idea that they might be related to one another, that they might share common ancestors or respond to their environments by changing over generations, these ideas had not yet taken root. But then came the age of exploration, and suddenly the known world expanded. Ships returned from distant lands carrying specimens that no European had ever seen. Plants with strange leaves and unfamiliar flowers, fruits of bizarre shapes and colors, woods with unexpected properties. Each voyage brought new questions, new categories that needed to be created, new mysteries to solve. In the 1500s, herbals began to appear, books dedicated entirely to describing and illustrating plants. Otto Brunfels published his Living Portraits of Plants with detailed woodcuts that showed what the plants actually looked like, not stylized symbols but careful representations. Leonhard Fuchs followed with his own herbal, even more precisely illustrated, showing roots and stems and flowers with scientific accuracy. These books were expensive, laborious to produce, but they represented something new, a commitment to seeing plants as they truly were, to recording their forms with fidelity. And there was a doctor in Italy named Andrea Cesalpino who looked at the work of classification and felt that it needed a new foundation. He proposed that plants should be grouped not just by obvious similarities, but by their fruits and seeds, by their reproductive structures. This was a radical idea, that the key to understanding plants lay in how they perpetuated themselves. The 1600s brought new tools. The microscope allowed scholars to see what had always been invisible. Robert Hooke in England examined a thin slice of cork and saw that it was made of tiny chambers. He called them cells, little rooms, though what he was seeing were actually the empty walls left behind after the living cells had died. Marcello Malpighi in Italy looked at living plant tissue under his lenses and saw structures within structures, vessels that carried fluids, tissues that performed different functions. The plant body revealed itself as far more complex than anyone had imagined. Not a simple green substance, but an architecture, an organization of specialized parts. Nehemiah Grew published The Anatomy of Plants, describing the internal structures he observed, the way wood was laid down in annual rings, the way sap moved through vessels, the differences between the anatomy of stems and roots and leaves. Each page added detail to the emerging picture of how plants were constructed. But even as these investigators peered deeper into the plant body, the larger question of how to organize the diversity of plant life remained unsolved. There were thousands of known species now, tens of thousands, and more arriving with every ship. How could they be arranged in a way that made sense, that revealed something true about their nature? John Ray in England worked for decades on this problem. He introduced the concept of species as the fundamental unit. A species was a group of plants that bred true, that produced offspring like themselves. This was a practical definition, one that could be tested and observed. Ray also saw that species could be grouped into larger categories, genera based on shared characteristics. He published catalogs attempting to organize all known plants, but the system was complex, hard to use, full of exceptions and special cases. Then in the 1700s, a Swedish naturalist named Carl Linnaeus approached the problem with fresh eyes and unshakable confidence. Linnaeus believed that nature had an order, a divine order, and that it was possible for the human mind to discover and describe it, he set out to name every living thing, to give each a place in a grand hierarchy that would make the relationships between organisms clearer. His insight was to use a simple binomial system, 2 names for each species, the first indicating the genus, the broader group, the second indicating the specific type within that genus, Rosa canina, Rosa rugosa. Each species of rose with its own epithet, but all clearly grouped together. The system was elegant, memorable, practical. It could be learned and applied by anyone who studied plants, and Linnaeus applied it with remarkable thoroughness, publishing his Species Plantarum in 1753, a work that attempted to name and classify every plant known to European science. He based his classification primarily on the reproductive parts of plants, counting stamens and pistils, using these numbers to create groups and subdivisions. It was an artificial system in many ways. It grouped together plants that were not truly related, but it worked. It gave botanists a common language, a shared framework, and the binomial names he created stuck, became standard, are still used today, even though the classification system built around them has been revised and revised again as understanding deepened. Linnaeus worked from specimens, dried plants pressed flat and mounted on paper, sent to him from correspondents around the world. He had students who traveled on expeditions seeking new species, new additions to the catalog, and many of them died in the pursuit of fever, of a shipwreck, of the countless dangers that came with traveling to remote and unfamiliar places. But the specimens kept arriving, and the herbaria grew. Vast libraries of pressed plants, reference collections that allowed comparison and study. You could hold in your hand a leaf collected 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and compare it with a fresh specimen, seeing what stayed constant and what varied. The 18th century also brought new questions about how plants actually lived, how they grew and functioned. Stephen Hales conducted experiments on the movement of water through plants, measuring the force with which sap rose, demonstrating that leaves gave off moisture to the air, that plants were not passive objects but dynamic systems, constantly taking in and releasing substances. Joseph Priestley discovered that plants affected the air around them, that a plant in a sealed container could restore air that a candle had exhausted. He didn't fully understand what was happening, didn't yet know about oxygen and carbon dioxide, but he had glimpsed the great exchange, the way plants transform the atmosphere. Jan Ingenhousz built on this work, showing that plants needed light to purify air, that in darkness they did the opposite. He was approaching the truth of photosynthesis, though the full mechanism would take many more decades to unravel. These investigators were learning that plants were not simple, not easily reduced to description and classification. They were chemical factories, performing transformations that seemed almost miraculous, taking in water and air and light, and from these immaterial things, building solid matter, wood and leaf and root, substance from sunlight. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Each discovery opened new territories of ignorance, revealed how much remained unknown. And so the 19th century arrived, bringing with it new tools, new ideas, new ways of seeing that would transform botany from a practice of collecting and naming into something deeper, something that sought to understand not just what plants were, but how they came to be. The world was being mapped, explored, catalogued with an intensity that had never existed before. Botanical gardens flourished in European capitals. Glass houses rose like crystal palaces, their curved panes holding climates from distant lands. Tropical heat in London, desert dryness in Paris, allowing plants from every corner of the earth to be studied side by side. Expeditions set out with botanists aboard, men who would spend years in remote regions, collecting specimens, making drawings, pressing plants between sheets of paper, sometimes tens of thousands of specimens from a single journey, each one carefully labeled with the location where it was found, the date, the conditions in which it grew. Alexander von Humboldt traveled through South America, climbing mountains and traversing jungles, and as he went he noticed patterns. He saw that plants changed with elevation, that climbing a mountain in the tropics was like traveling from the equator to the poles, each 1,000 feet of altitude bringing a new community of plants, adapted to cooler temperatures, thinner air. He understood that plants didn't exist in isolation. They were shaped by their environments, by temperature and rainfall and soil, and the presence of other organisms. He began to see ecology, though the word didn't exist yet, the web of relationships that connected living things to each other and to the physical world. Robert Brown in England was looking through his microscopes at pollen grains, watching them jiggle and dance in water, a random motion that would later bear his name. But more importantly, he was looking at the internal structure of cells, and he saw within them a darker spot, a nucleus, a center that seemed to be present in all living cells. Matthias Schleiden looked at plant tissues and proposed that all plants were made of cells, that the cell was the fundamental unit of plant life. And Theodor Schwann extended this idea to animals. Together they formulated cell theory, the recognition that all living things were cellular, that life was built from these microscopic chambers, each one a small world unto itself. The implications were staggering. It meant that a towering oak and a tiny moss were built on the same principles, that life had a unity, a common architecture, regardless of how different organisms might appear on the surface. Meanwhile, the mystery of how plants reproduced was finally being solved. For centuries it had been unclear whether plants had sexes, whether they truly had male and female parts, or whether seeds simply formed spontaneously. But careful observation and experimentation revealed the truth. The stamens produced pollen, the pistils received it, and without the transfer of pollen from one to the other, most plants would produce no seeds. The bright petals, the sweet nectar, the intricate shapes of flowers, all of it served the purpose of facilitating this transfer, attracting insects and birds, or catching the wind, ensuring that pollen reached its destination. Christian Conrad Sprengel documented how flowers and insects were matched to each other, how the shape of a flower might fit exactly the tongue of a particular bee, how colors and scents advertised the presence of a nectar, how the whole arrangement was a kind of commerce, the plant offering food in exchange for the service of pollination. And then there was the question that loomed over all of biology, the question of where species came from, why there were so many different forms of life, and why they seemed so perfectly suited to their particular environments. The old answer, that each species was separately created, fixed, and unchanging, was beginning to seem inadequate. There were too many fossils of creatures that no longer lived, too many similarities between different species that suggested relationship rather than independent origin, too many odd details that made sense only if species had histories, if they changed over time. Charles Darwin spent 5 years sailing around the world on the Beagle, and everywhere he went he collected plants, noted their distributions, wondered why certain species were found only in particular places, why islands had their own unique forms, why plants on opposite sides of a mountain range might be so different. He returned to England and began breeding plants, pigeons and orchids and primroses, watching how variation could be selected, how choosing certain individuals to reproduce could, over generations, create forms that were dramatically different from the starting point, and slowly, through years of observation and thought and correspondence with other naturalists, he developed his theory, narration, that species changed over time through natural selection, that random variations occurred, and those variations that helped an organism survive and reproduce would be passed on, while those that hindered would disappear. Plants were central to his thinking. He wrote entire books about climbing plants and insectivorous plants and the movements of plants, documenting the endless ingenuity of adaptation, the way a Venus flytrap could snap shut on an insect in a fraction of a second, the way a tendril could spiral around a support, the way some plants could track the sun across the sky. When On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, it changed everything. Suddenly, the diversity of life had an explanation, a mechanism. Species were not fixed but fluid, shaped by time and circumstance, related to each other through descent from common ancestors. Botanists began to rethink classification, to search for natural groupings based on evolutionary relationships rather than superficial similarities. The goal now was to reconstruct the tree of life, to understand which plants shared recent common ancestors and which had diverged long ago. But even as evolution provided a framework for understanding the diversity of life, it raised a question that Darwin couldn't answer. How were traits passed from parent to offspring? What was the mechanism of inheritance? In a monastery garden in what is now the Czech Republic, an Augustinian friar named Gregor Mendel was conducting experiments with pea plants, choosing varieties with clear differences, tall versus short, green seeds versus yellow, wrinkled versus smooth. He cross-pollinated these plants by hand, carefully transferring pollen from one flower to another, then collecting the seeds and planting them, watching what traits appeared in the next generation and the generation after that. What he found was that traits didn't blend. A cross between a tall plant and a short plant didn't produce medium plants. Instead, the offspring were tall, but when these tall plants were bred with each other, some of their offspring were short. The trait for shortness had been hidden, masked by the trait for tallness, but not lost. Mendel worked out mathematical ratios, 3:1, 9:3 to 3:1, patterns that suggested traits were controlled by discrete factors, what we now call genes, factors that came in pairs, one from each parent, and that could be dominant or recessive. He published his work in 1866 in an obscure journal, and almost no one noticed. The paper sat in libraries, unread, unremarked upon, while Mendel returned to his administrative duties and his experiments with bees and his observations of meteorology. It would be 34 years before his work was rediscovered, before three botanists working independently: Hugo de Vries, Karl Correns, Erich von Tschermak, each conducting their own experiments with plant breeding, each coming to similar conclusions, and each finding, when they searched the literature, that Mendel had been there before them. The rediscovery of Mendel's laws in 1900 marked the birth of genetics as a science. Suddenly, there was a mechanism for inheritance, a way to understand how traits were passed on, and eventually how they could change, creating the variation that natural selection worked upon. Botanists began using genetics to understand plant breeding in new ways, to predict the outcomes of crosses, to select for desired traits with greater precision, to understand why some plant varieties bred true, while others produced wildly variable offspring. But the physical basis of heredity remained mysterious. Where exactly were these factors, these genes, located? How did they work? The answer lay in the cell, in the nucleus that Robert Brown had seen decades earlier. Researchers, using ever better microscopes, observed thread-like structures that appeared during cell division, structures that divided and were distributed to daughter cells, chromosomes, and gradually it became clear that chromosomes carried the hereditary material, that genes were arranged along chromosomes like beads on a string, that the behavior of chromosomes during reproduction explained Mendel's ratios, explained why some traits were linked together, passed on as a unit. Thomas Hunt Morgan worked this out using fruit flies, but plant geneticists contributed essential insights, studying maize and tobacco and evening primrose, documenting mutations, tracking the inheritance of traits through multiple generations, building maps that showed the relative positions of genes on chromosomes. Barbara McClintock spent years studying maize chromosomes under the microscope, learning to recognize each individual chromosome by its shape and banding pattern. And she discovered something unexpected, that some genetic elements could move, could jump from one position to another, changing the expression of nearby genes. This was so contrary to the prevailing view that genes were fixed in position on chromosomes that her work was met with skepticism. It would be decades before the importance of these jumping genes, transposable elements, was fully recognized. Meanwhile, the chemistry of plants was being explored in ever greater detail. Scientists were isolating and identifying the compounds that plants produced, not just the familiar substances like sugars and starches, but thousands of other molecules, alkaloids and terpenoids and phenolics, compounds that gave plants their colors and scents, that defended them against herbivores, that attracted pollinators or inhibited the growth of competing plants. The process of photosynthesis was being worked out step by step. Researchers discovered that it happened in special structures within plant cells, chloroplasts, small green organelles packed with membranes. They found that photosynthesis had two stages: light reactions that captured energy from sunlight and used it to split water molecules, releasing oxygen as a byproduct, and then the Calvin cycle, where carbon dioxide from the air was fixed into organic molecules, the building blocks of sugars, and all the other compounds the plant needed. Melvin Calvin worked out the details of this cycle, feeding plants radioactive carbon dioxide, then killing them at intervals and analyzing which compounds contained the radioactive carbon, tracing the path of carbon as it was incorporated into increasingly complex molecules. It was intricate work, requiring patience and precision, And when it was complete, it revealed one of the most important chemical processes on Earth, the process that captured the energy that powered nearly all life, that had filled the atmosphere with oxygen billions of years ago, that continued to balance the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen, making the planet habitable. The 20th century brought tools that would have seemed like magic to earlier botanists, machines that could see deeper, measure more precisely, manipulate life itself at scales that were almost incomprehensible. X-ray crystallography revealed the structure of molecules, showing how atoms were arranged in three-dimensional space, and in 1953, when James Watson and Francis Crick worked out the structure of DNA using data from Rosalind Franklin's crystallographic images, the physical basis of heredity was finally laid bare. DNA was a double helix. Two strands wound around each other, each strand made of a sequence of 4 different bases, and the sequence of these bases encoded information, the instructions for building proteins, for regulating when and where genes were turned on or off, for everything that made one organism different from another. Plant geneticists now had a molecular foundation for their work. They could begin to understand not just that genes existed, but what genes were made of, how they were copied when cells divided, how mutations arose when the copying process made errors, how the information in DNA was translated into the physical reality of leaves and roots and flowers. The field of plant physiology deepened its understanding of how plants sensed and responded to their environments. Researchers discovered that plants had hormones, chemical messengers that coordinated growth and development, auxins that controlled cell elongation, gibberellins that triggered stem growth, cytokinins that promoted cell division, abscisic acid that helped plants respond to stress. These hormones didn't work in isolation. They interacted in complex networks. The same hormone could have different effects depending on concentration, on which tissue it was in, on what other hormones were present. The plant body emerged as a sophisticated system of chemical signaling, constantly adjusting its growth and development in response to conditions. Scientists found that plants could sense light not just to photosynthesize, but to know what time of day it was, what season. Whether they were shaded by other plants, they had multiple photoreceptors, proteins that changed shape when struck by specific wavelengths of light, and these changes triggered cascades of responses, affecting which genes were turned on, how the plant grew, when it flowered. The discovery of phytochrome, a photoreceptor that detects red and far red light, helped explain how plants measure day length, how they know when to flower. Some plants needed long days to trigger flowering. Others needed short days, and they measured the length of darkness with precision, using the ratio of different forms of phytochrome as a molecular clock. Plants could sense gravity, touch, temperature, water availability. Each sense had its own receptors, its own signaling pathways, and all of these pathways converged and interacted, allowing the plant to integrate multiple sources of information and produce coordinated responses. When a root tip was touched, cells at the point of a contact produced signals that traveled to other parts of the root, causing it to grow away from the obstacle. When a tendril touched a support, cells on the side of contact stopped elongating, while cells on the opposite side continued to grow, causing the tendril to curl around the support, The plant didn't have a brain, didn't have neurons, but it processed information, made decisions in a distributed way through the collective behavior of cells responding to chemical signals. Ecology matured as a science, moving beyond description to quantitative analysis and experimentation. Plant ecologists measured energy flow through ecosystems, nutrient cycling, competition and facilitation between species. They tracked how plant communities changed over time, succession, the gradual replacement of one set of species by another as conditions changed. They discovered that plants didn't just respond to their environments, they created environments. A forest changes the light reaching the ground, the temperature, the humidity, the soil chemistry, and these changes determine which other plants can grow there, which animals can live there, what microbes thrive in the soil. The concept of the ecosystem emerged, a community of organisms together with their physical environment, interacting in ways that could be studied and modeled. Energy entering as sunlight, flowing through food webs, dissipating as heat, nutrients cycling through plants and soil and decomposers, and back to plants again. Conservation became urgent as habitats vanished, as plant species went extinct before they could even be described. Botanists raced to catalog biodiversity, to understand ecosystems before they disappeared, to identify which species were most at risk, which habitats were most critical to preserve. Seed banks were established, repositories where seeds could be stored in cold, dry conditions, remaining viable for decades or centuries. Insurance against extinction, against the loss of genetic diversity. Thousands of samples carefully cataloged, representing wild species and heritage crop varieties and rare plants from threatened habitats. And then came the tools of molecular biology, restriction enzymes that could cut DNA at specific sequences, allowing researchers to manipulate genes, to move them from one organism to another, to create combinations that had never existed in nature. The first genetically modified plant was created in 1983, a tobacco plant with a bacterial gene inserted into its genome. The gene made the plant resistant to an antibiotic, proof that foreign DNA could be introduced and would function, that the genetic code was universal, that a gene from any organism could potentially work in any other. This opened possibilities that were both exciting and troubling. Crops could be engineered to resist pests, to tolerate herbicides, to produce higher yields, to grow in marginal soils, to contain more nutrients. But there were questions about unintended consequences, about ecological risks, about corporate control of genetic resources, about whether humanity had the wisdom to wield such power responsibly. Disease-resistant papayas saved Hawaii's papaya industry. Golden rice was developed to produce beta-carotene, addressing vitamin A deficiency in regions where rice was a staple, but other modifications were more controversial. Crops designed to work with specific herbicides, raising concerns about increased chemical use, about the evolution of resistant weeds. Sequencing technology improved exponentially, becoming faster, cheaper, just more accessible, and botanists began sequencing entire plant genomes. First, the tiny genome of Arabidopsis thaliana, a small weedy plant that became the laboratory model for plant biology. Then rice, then maize, then hundreds of other species. Each genome was a text written in the four-letter alphabet of DNA, millions or billions of letters long. And within these texts were the instructions for building a plant, for responding to environments, for surviving and reproducing. Comparing genomes revealed evolutionary relationships, showed which genes were conserved across all plants, which were unique to particular lineages, which had been duplicated and modified to take on new functions. Phylogenetics was revolutionized. Instead of relying on visible characteristics that could be misleading, that could evolve independently in different lineages, researchers could compare DNA sequences directly, building family trees based on the accumulation of mutations over millions of years. The plant tree of life was redrawn. Some groups that had seemed closely related based on appearance turned out to be distant cousins. Others that looked nothing alike were revealed to be siblings. The history of plant evolution came into sharper focus. The ancient split between mosses and vascular plants, the later divergence of ferns and seed plants, the relatively recent origin of flowering plants and their explosive diversification, chloroplasts and mitochondria, the organelles that performed photosynthesis and respiration were revealed to have their own small genomes, remnants of their origin as free-living bacteria that had been engulfed by ancient host cells billions of years ago. Endosymbiosis, a merger that had made complex life possible, that had allowed cells to harness the power of photosynthesis and oxygen metabolism. Climate change became impossible to ignore, and botanists documented its effects. Shifts in flowering times, changes in geographic ranges as species tracked their preferred temperatures northward or upward in elevation, mismatches developing between plants and their pollinators when warming temperatures caused them to respond differently, disruptions cascading through ecosystems. Plants from herbaria collected a century or two earlier became invaluable. Pressed specimens that showed exactly when plants had flowered in the past, where species had grown before the climate changed, providing baselines for comparison, showing how much and how fast things were shifting. Researchers worked to understand how plants would respond to higher carbon dioxide levels, to altered rainfall patterns, to more frequent droughts and heat waves. Some species would benefit, at least initially, growing faster with more carbon dioxide available, but others would struggle, unable to tolerate the heat, unable to compete with invading species from warmer regions. The study of plant stress responses intensified. How did plants survive drought? How did they tolerate salt in the soil, extreme temperatures, poor nutrition? Understanding these mechanisms might allow the development of crops that could withstand harsher conditions, that could feed a growing population on a changing planet. Single-cell sequencing emerged, allowing researchers to analyze individual cells from a plant tissue to see which genes were active in which cell types, revealing that even cells that looked identical under a microscope could be performing very different functions, expressing different sets of genes. The root tip, that small zone of dividing cells pushing through the soil, turned out to contain dozens of distinct cell types, each with its own gene expression profile, each contributing to the coordinated effort of growth and navigation, sensing gravity and moisture and nutrients and obstacles, integrating all this information to determine which direction to grow. CRISPR gene editing arrived, a tool of unprecedented precision, allowing specific changes to be made at specific locations in the genome, not just adding foreign genes, but editing existing ones, correcting mutations, modifying regulatory sequences, creating variations that could then be tested to understand what each gene did, how each element of the genome contributed to the organism's function. The boundary between basic research and application blurred. Understanding how plants worked at the molecular level had immediate practical implications for agriculture, for conservation, for responding to environmental challenges. And through all of this, through centuries of observation and experimentation, of theory and discovery, the plants themselves continued doing what they had always done, converting light to matter, breathing out oxygen, anchoring ecosystems, evolving in response to changing conditions, enduring. The science of botany had grown from simple description to sophisticated analysis, from cataloging diversity to manipulating genes, but in many ways the fundamental questions remained the same. How do plants live? How do they grow and reproduce? How do they interact with their environments and with each other? How did they come to be the way they are? Each answer revealed new depths of complexity, new questions. The more we learned, the more we understood how much remained to learn. How many mysteries still waited in the tissues of a leaf, in the chemistry of a flower, in the silent communication between root and fungus beneath the soil. And yet, standing in that imagined greenhouse as full darkness settles outside, I find myself thinking not about the grand machinery of science, not about genomes and CRISPR and climate models, but about something simpler, something that preceded all the theories and remains when they are set aside. The experience of being near plants, of existing in their presence. There is something that happens in a forest, something that cannot be fully captured in measurements, a quality of light filtered through leaves, the particular silence that comes from being surrounded by living things that make no sound, the way time seems to move differently when the only changes are the slow turning of stems towards sun, the gradual unfurling of a fern frond over days. Indigenous peoples around the world have always known things about plants that science is only beginning to confirm, that trees communicate through fungal networks in the soil, sharing nutrients, sending chemical warnings about pest attacks, that a forest is not a collection of individuals, but a community, interconnected, interdependent, the mycorrhizal networks, the fungal threads that connect root to root, tree to tree, have been called the wood wide web, and the metaphor captures something true. Information flows through these connections. Resources are redistributed. A large tree can support its offspring growing in deep shade, sending them carbon through the fungal links until they are tall enough to reach better light. Plants release volatile, organic compounds into the air when they are attacked by insects, and neighboring plants detect these compounds and activate their own defenses, preparing for attack before it arrives. Some plants can even distinguish between compounds released by their relatives and those from strangers. Responding more strongly to kin, this is communication of a sort, not intentional perhaps, not conscious, but functional, effective. Plants responding to information from their environment, including information from other plants. And there is the mystery of plant intelligence, a phrase that makes some scientists uncomfortable. Intelligence without a brain, without neurons. But what else to call the way a vine navigates a complex environment? extending tendrils in multiple directions, exploring space, making choices about which support to climb, which direction offers the best path upward toward light. The Venus flytrap counts when a trigger hair inside its trap is touched once. Nothing happens, but if the same hair is touched again within 20 seconds, or if a second hair is touched, the trap snaps shut. This prevents the plant from wasting energy on false alarms, on raindrops or wind-blown debris. It waits for the pattern that indicates actual prey, memory of a sort, information stored in the form of electrical and chemical signals, persisting long enough to be combined with new information, to trigger a response only when the right conditions are met. Plants can learn, can be trained through repeated stimuli to stop responding to something harmless. Habituation, the same basic form of learning seen in animals with nervous systems, accomplished through different mechanisms but serving the same function, allowing the organism to allocate resources efficiently to distinguish signal from noise. These discoveries have a way of unsettling the categories we use to organize the world, plant and animal, passive and active, insensate and aware. The boundaries become less clear, not because plants are like animals, but because both are manifestations of something deeper, the problem-solving creativity of evolution, finding solutions to the challenges of survival through whatever materials are available. A plant cannot run from danger, cannot hunt for food, and so it has evolved different strategies, chemical defenses, the ability to regrow from fragments, partnerships with other organisms, timing its reproduction to avoid the worst stresses, storing resources underground, producing thousands of seeds to ensure that some will find suitable conditions. The diversity of these strategies is staggering. Orchids that mimic female wasps to trick males into pollinating them, pitcher plants that drown and digest insects in pools of enzyme-rich liquid, strangler figs that germinate in the canopy and send roots down to the ground, eventually enclosing and killing their host tree, taking its place in the forest. Each species is a unique solution to the problem of survival, refined over millions of years, tested against the reality of droughts and floods, of herbivores and pathogens, of competition for light and water and nutrients, and the solutions that worked, persisted, were passed on, were modified by subsequent generations. Walking through a botanical garden or through any place where plants grow is to walk through a gallery of evolutionary experiments, each leaf shape optimized for particular light conditions, each root system adapted to particular soil types, each flower structured to attract particular pollinators. And we are only beginning to understand the full extent of what plants do, how they shape the world, how they make it livable for everything else. The oxygen we breathe, all of it was produced by photosynthesis, by cyanobacteria first, billions of years ago, and then by the chloroplasts they became when incorporated into plant cells. Every breath is a gift from ancient and ongoing photosynthesis. The soil beneath our feet, built by plants and the organisms that decompose them, by roots breaking rock, by organic matter accumulating, transforming mineral substrate into the rich medium that supports terrestrial life. The rainforests that stabilize climate, that generate rainfall, that house most of Earth's terrestrial biodiversity, are constructed by plants, their architecture creating habitats, their metabolism driving the cycling of water and carbon and nutrients. Even grassland, seeming simpler, are extraordinarily productive ecosystems, their roots extending deep, storing carbon in the soil, supporting communities of grazers, their seasonal cycles of growth and dormancy, creating a rhythm that countless other species depend upon. Plants are not a background, not decoration, not passive recipients of whatever conditions they encounter. They are primary producers, foundation species, ecosystem engineers, the organisms that make most other terrestrial life possible. And here in this greenhouse that exists half in imagination, half in the accumulated experience of every greenhouse I have ever entered, I think about continuity, about the seeds stored in vaults, about the gardens tended across generations, about the knowledge passed down and built upon. There are trees alive today that were already ancient when the first botanical gardens were planted. When Theophrastus walked through Greek gardens making his observations, when Linnaeus developed his classification system, they have been growing, weathering storms, enduring droughts, producing seeds for longer than human institutions have existed. There are seeds that can remain viable for decades, for centuries, waiting for the right conditions, patient in a way that animals cannot be. And when those conditions arrive, when water and warmth and oxygen reach the embryo inside the seed coat, metabolism resumes, cells divide, a root pushes out, then a shoot, and the whole process begins again. This is what plants do. They persist, they wait, they grow when conditions allow. They produce seeds and spores and fragments that can survive when the parent cannot. They occupy every available niche, from desert to tundra to tropical canopy, from scorching hot springs to freezing mountaintops, from the driest places to lakes and oceans. 490 million years ago, plants moved onto land, greening the continents, transforming the planet, and they have been here ever since, diversifying, adapting, spreading, creating the foundations for everything that followed. We study them, catalog them, manipulate their genes, walk among them, eat them, build with them, breathe the oxygen they produce, and still they remain in some way unknowable, other, living according to rhythms and rules that are not our own. The greenhouse is dark now, the glass panes barely visible, reflecting more than revealing, and inside the plants continue their slow work, their leaves still processing whatever light reaches them, their roots still drawing water from the soil, their cells still dividing, still elongating, still building the structures that will allow them to grow a little more tomorrow, to capture a little more light, to produce a little more biomass. There is no urgency in their growths, no hurry, just the steady accumulation of days, of photons captured and carbon fixed, of water drawn up from roots to leaves and transpired back to the atmosphere, of seasons turning, of the patient unfolding of patterns written into chromosomes millions of years ago and modified slightly with each generation. I think of all the botanists who came before, who looked at plants with wonder and tried to understand, who measured and dissected and classified and experimented, who bred and hybridized and sequenced, who spent careers studying the structure of a single protein, the function of a single gene, the ecology of a single habitat. Each contributed a piece to the vast puzzle, each added to the accumulating knowledge, and yet the puzzle remains incomplete, still growing, still revealing new patterns, new questions. Perhaps it will always be this way. Perhaps the complexity is too great to ever fully comprehend. Too many genes interacting, too many environmental variables, too many levels of organization, from molecules to cells to tissues, to organisms to populations to ecosystems. Or perhaps we will continue to deepen our understanding, finding new tools, asking new questions, seeing patterns we missed before, connecting what seemed unconnected. Either way, the plants will continue, doing what they have always done, growing toward light, extending roots toward water, responding to seasons, reproducing, adapting, evolving, being what they are. And we will continue to watch, to wonder, to study, to try to put into words and equations and models something that ultimately exists beyond our descriptions, in the green reality of chloroplasts converting light to sugar, in the silent communication of roots and fungi, in the opening of a flower at dawn, in the fall of leaves as winter approaches. The greenhouse stands in darkness, holding its collection of lives from around the world, each plant a small infinity of molecular processes, of genetic information expressed in three-dimensional form, of evolutionary history made manifest in leaf and stem and root. And outside, beyond the glass, the larger world holds billions more, forests and meadows and wetlands, gardens and farms and wild places, all of it green, all of it photosynthesizing, all of it part of the great web of plant life that covers the continents, that makes the world habitable. That has been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years. The study of this world, botany, continues in laboratories and field stations, in herbaria and seed banks, in botanical gardens and research forests, carried forward by people who have chosen to spend their lives trying to understand plants, adding their observations to the great accumulation of knowledge, asking the next question, making the next discovery. And the plants themselves, as subjects of all this attention, objects of study and wonder, continue their ancient work, silent, green, alive, converting light to life, breathing out oxygen, building soil, creating habitats, simply being in the way that only plants can be. The darkness is complete now, the greenhouse a shadow against the night sky, and somewhere inside, in the stillness, a seed is germinating, a root is extending, a leaf is preparing to unfold when morning comes, and light returns, as it always does, as it always has, as the earth turns and the cycle continues, endlessly, patiently, green. There is a kind of music that moves like water, slow and winding, carrying with it the voices of 1,000 nights, the laughter spilling from dimly lit doorways, the hum of a city that never quite sleeps, and the heartbeat of something ancient and new all at once. It begins somewhere deep in memory, in the place where sound becomes feeling, where a single note can stretch across an entire room and fill it with longing or joy, or the bittersweet ache of something beautiful passing by. Tonight, I find myself walking through the story of this music, this art form that has no single birthplace, no moment when it sprang fully formed into the world, but rather emerged slowly like dawn breaking over the Mississippi Delta, like the first stars appearing over the streets of New Orleans, gradual and inevitable and utterly transformative. The air feels thick with history, humid with the breath of generations, and if I listen carefully, I can almost hear it, the distant echo of work songs drifting across fields, the rhythmic pulse of drums that remember a different shore, the interweaving melodies of cultures colliding and conversing in the vibrant chaos of a port city where anything seems possible. This music, jazz, it doesn't arrive with fanfare or announcement. It seeps into existence like groundwater finding its way to the surface, pooling in the places where people gather, where they celebrate and mourn, where they transform their sorrow into something transcendent and their joy into something that can be shared. I imagine the streets at twilight, gas lamps casting their warm glow on cobblestones worn smooth by countless footsteps, the sound of a cornet cutting through the evening air, clear and bright and entirely itself, playing a melody that sounds familiar and utterly new at the same time, bending notes in ways that make the heart lean forward, curious, captivated. There are moments when music becomes more than entertainment, more than background, when it becomes the very language through which a community speaks its truth, its pain, its resilience, its refusal to be silenced or diminished, and jazz, from its earliest whispers, has been that kind of music, born from the collision of African rhythms and European harmonies, shaped by the spirituals sung in churches and the field hollers that marked time in the brutal heat of the day, refined in the dance halls and honky-tonks, where people came to forget their troubles, or at least to dance with them for a while. The geography matters here, the way certain cities become crucibles, places where the right combination of people and circumstances creates something that cannot be replicated. New Orleans, sitting at the mouth of the great river, a city of countless influences, French and Spanish and Caribbean and African, all swirling together in a cultural gumbo so rich that it births entirely new forms of expression. I think about the instruments themselves, the way a trumpet can sound like a human voice, full of vibrato and emotion, the way a clarinet can weave arabesques of sound that seem to spiral upward into the night, the deep thrum of a bass that holds everything together, anchoring the conversation, providing the foundation upon which improvisation can build its momentary cathedrals, because that's what jazz is, at its core, a conversation, a dialogue between musicians who listen as much as they play, who respond to each other in real time, creating something that has never existed before and will never exist again in quite the same way. The music carries within it the memory of struggle, the weight of history, but also an irrepressible spirit of innovation, of making something beautiful out of whatever materials are at hand, of turning limitation into creativity, of saying yes to possibility even when the world seems determined to say no. And so, as the evening deepens, as the streetlights flicker on one by one, I prepare to follow this music through time, to trace its evolution from those early days when it was just beginning to find its voice, through decades of transformation and reinvention, watching it spread from the dance halls of New Orleans to the concert halls of the world, always changing, always itself, a river of sound that never stops flowing. The story begins, as so many American stories do, with the convergence of cultures that had no intention of meeting, with the forced migration of millions of African people across an ocean they never wished to cross, carrying with them musical traditions that would prove impossible to extinguish, rhythms and call and response patterns that lived in the body, in the memory, in the soul. In the fields and on the plantations of the American South, music became a lifeline, a way to communicate, to preserve identity, to maintain humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Work songs matched the rhythm of labor, transforming the monotony of physical toil into something bearable, something communal, while spirituals spoke of deliverance and dignity, often encoding messages that the enslaved could understand, but their oppressors could not. These traditions carried within them the DNA of what would become jazz, the polyrhythmic complexity of West African drumming, the practice of improvisation, the concept of music as a participatory experience rather than a passive performance. All of this survived, adapted, and waited for the right moment to transform into something new. The moment, or rather the gradual unfolding, began in earnest in New Orleans, a city unlike any other in 19th century America. French and Spanish colonial influences had created a more fluid racial hierarchy than existed elsewhere in the South, and the city's position as a major port meant a constant influx of musical ideas from the Caribbean, from Europe, from South America, all mixing in the humid air along with the smell of chicory coffee and river water. In Congo Square, a public space where enslaved people were permitted to gather on Sunday afternoons, African musical traditions were performed openly. Drums, spoken languages remembered from across the ocean, dances maintained their connection to ancestral practices, and this cultural persistence would prove crucial, keeping alive the rhythmic sophistication and improvisational spirit that would later infuse jazz with its distinctive character after emancipation to her in the late 1800s. New Orleans became a hothouse for musical experimentation. Black musicians, many of whom had served in military bands during the Civil War, found themselves with instruments and training, but few opportunities in a society determined to maintain white supremacy through other means, and so they played where they could, in the streets, in saloons, at picnics and parades and funerals. The brass band tradition flourished particularly in New Orleans. These ensembles would march through the streets, playing for social clubs and benevolent societies, and especially for funerals, developing the tradition of the jazz funeral, where somber dirges accompanied the deceased to the cemetery. But on the return journey, the music would transform into jubilant celebration, a musical acknowledgement of death and life intertwined, sorrow and joy inseparable. In these brass bands, something new was happening. Musicians began to embellish the written melodies, adding their own flourishes and variations, bending notes in ways that classical European training would never permit, playing what would come to be called blue notes, flatted thirds and sevenths that gave the music its emotional depth, its connection to the blues, that other great wellspring of African-American musical innovation. The blues had been developing in parallel, primarily in the Mississippi Delta, a music of solo singers accompanying themselves on guitar or piano, telling stories of hardship and heartbreak, of leaving and longing, of small moments of pleasure in difficult lives. And the blues brought to the emerging jazz its harmonic structure, its emotional directness, its unflinching honesty about the human condition. Ragtime, too, was part of the mixture. Scott Joplin and other composers had created a pianistic style that syncopated European march rhythms, placing accents in unexpected places, creating a bouncing, propulsive feel that made people want to move, want to dance. And Ragtime's sophisticated compositional approach showed that black musicians could master European formal structures while simultaneously subverting and transforming them. In the dance halls and social clubs of Storyville, New Orleans' legal red light district from 1897 to 1917, pianists played ragtime and blues, while small ensembles began to develop a looser, more collectively improvised approach to popular songs and dance numbers. This wasn't yet called jazz. The term wouldn't come into common usage for several more years, but the music was finding its form, its voice, its grammar. The instrumentation was beginning to settle into recognizable patterns. A front line of cornet, clarinet, and trombone, playing interwoven melodic lines in a polyphonic texture where each instrument had its own voice, its own role in the conversation. The cornet typically carried the melody. The clarinet wove ornate counter-melodies above, and the trombone provided punctuation and harmonic support below, while behind them a rhythm section of piano, banjo or guitar, bass, and drums kept time and supplied the harmonic foundation. One of the legendary figures from this period, a man named Buddy Bolden, played cornet with such power and distinctive style that he became the talk of the city. Though no recordings of his playing survive, the stories persist, descriptions of how he could play so loudly that he could be heard across town, how he drew crowds wherever he performed, how he took hymns and popular songs and transformed them into something else entirely, something that made people dance and shout and lose themselves in the music. Charles Buddy Bolden's life, like so many early jazz musicians, ended tragically. Mental illness claimed him in 1907, and he spent the last decades of his life in an institution, never having recorded a single note, and yet his influence rippled outward, shaping the players who came after him, establishing the idea that a jazz musician should have a distinctive personal sound, a voice as recognizable as a speaking voice. Other pioneers were developing their own approaches. Freddie Keppard, another cornetist, known for his powerful tone and creative variations, Joe King Oliver, who would later mentor a young Louis Armstrong, developing a style that used mutes and vocal effects to make his horn weep and laugh and speak, and pianists like Jelly Roll Morton, who claimed, perhaps with some justification, to have invented jazz in 1902, though the truth is that jazz had many parents and no single birth certificate. Jelly Roll Morton, born Ferdinand Joseph Lamothe, was a brilliantly talented and notoriously boastful pianist and composer. His music bridged ragtime and jazz, incorporating Latin rhythms from his Creole heritage, adding blues feeling to sophisticated compositions, and creating arrangements that balanced written structure with space for improvisation. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in those early days, that jazz required both composition and spontaneity, both form and freedom. The racial dynamics of New Orleans shaped the music in complex ways. The city recognized not just black and white, but also Creole, people of mixed African and European ancestry, who often had access to formal musical training and occupied a somewhat distinct social position. When segregation hardened in the early 1900s, Creole musicians found themselves forced into the same spaces as darker-skinned black musicians, And this collision, though born of injustice, proved musically fertile. Creole musicians brought formal training, the ability to read music, familiarity with European classical techniques, while black musicians from uptown brought stronger connections to blues and spirituals, a more improvisational approach, a raw emotional expression, and from this mixture, from the conversation between different traditions and approaches, jazz gained both its sophistication and its soul, its technical proficiency and its emotional immediacy. The music spread through live performance, through musicians traveling and carrying their innovations to other cities, but it remained largely undocumented, unrecorded, existing only in the moment of its performance and in the memories of those who heard it, until 1917, when technology and music intersected in a way that would change everything. The original Dixieland Joss Band, a group of white musicians from New Orleans who had learned by listening to black innovators, recorded what is generally considered the first jazz record. Released in 1917, the spelling would soon change from Joss to jazz, and while these musicians were not the inventors or even the best practitioners of the music, they had access to recording technology and mainstream distribution in ways that black musicians did not. This pattern of white musicians gaining commercial success by playing music developed by black artists would repeat throughout jazz history, a painful reminder of how American racism shaped not just who could play where, but who could profit, who could gain recognition, who would be remembered. And yet the music itself continued to develop, continued to evolve, carrying within it the voices and visions of those who created it, regardless of who received the credit or the royalties. And so the music began to travel, carried north by the Great Migration, that massive movement of black Americans leaving the South in search of opportunity, in search of safety, in search of lives less constrained by Jim Crow's suffocating grip. They brought their music with them, packed alongside their belongings, carrying it in their voices and their memories, and their hopes for what might be possible in cities like Chicago, Kansas City, and New York. Chicago became particularly important in the 1920s, a city of stockyards and steel mills, of speakeasies and nightclubs, where the music could find paying work and eager audiences. The south side of Chicago developed a vibrant jazz scene. Clubs like the Dreamland Cafe and the Sunset Cafe featured the best players, drawing crowds that wanted to dance, to drink, to forget prohibition and economic uncertainty, and simply lose themselves in the music's irresistible pulse. It was to Chicago that a young man named Louis Armstrong came in 1922, invited by his mentor King Oliver to join the Creole Jazz Band as second cornet. Armstrong had grown up in the poorest section of New Orleans, learned to play in a boy's home, and developed a talent so extraordinary that it would transform not just jazz, but the very concept of what a solo instrumentalist could be. Louis Armstrong's innovations cannot be overstated. Before him, jazz was primarily an ensemble music, a collective improvisation where individual voices blended into a polyphonic texture. But Armstrong brought a soloist's conception, playing with such technical virtuosity, such rhythmic sophistication, such emotional depth, that he simply demanded to be heard as an individual voice. He showed that jazz could be a medium for personal expression as powerful as poetry or painting. His tone was warm and expansive, his range extraordinary, But more than technical prowess, Armstrong possessed an ineffable sense of swing, that quality that makes jazz feel like it's floating slightly above the beat, pushing and pulling against the rhythm in ways that create tension and release, anticipation and satisfaction. He seemed to understand instinctively how to make time itself elastic, how to place notes in precisely the unexpected moment that would make the listener's heart lift. The Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings Armstrong made in the mid-1920s stand as monuments of early jazz. Tracks like West End Blues, which opens with an unaccompanied trumpet cadenza of such perfection that musicians still study it a century later, or Potato Head Blues with its stop-time solo that seems to reinvent rhythm itself. These recordings showed the world what jazz could be, how it could balance composition and improvisation, structure and freedom, intellect and emotion. But Armstrong wasn't alone. The 1920s saw an explosion of jazz talent, each musician developing a distinctive voice. Sidney Bechet on soprano saxophone and clarinet, playing with a wide vibrato and passionate intensity that rivaled Armstrong's cornet. Earl Hines on piano, creating a trumpet style of playing where the right hand played strong single-note lines that could cut through the ensemble like a horn, breaking away from the ragtime-influenced stride piano that had dominated before. In Kansas City, a different style was developing, looser and more blues-oriented than the Chicago sound, shaped by the political machine of Tom Pendergast, which kept the city wide open for nightlife even during Prohibition. Musicians could work all night, playing extended sets that encouraged long improvisations, developing ideas across many choruses, finding new paths through familiar chord progressions. The Kansas City style emphasized the blues, those 12-bar structures that had become fundamental to jazz, and it featured a new rhythmic approach. The rhythm section began to move away from the two-beat feel of early jazz, where the bass emphasized the first and third beats of each measure, toward a four-beat feel, where all four beats received equal emphasis, creating a more flowing, more propulsive groove that would eventually become standard in jazz. Count Basie, a pianist from New Jersey who came to Kansas City and fell in love with the music there, developed an approach that favored space and subtlety. His playing was economical, punctuating the music with sparse chords and perfectly timed interjections, trusting his band to create the momentum, and his orchestra, featuring the extraordinary tenor saxophonist Lester Young, would become one of the most influential ensembles in jazz history. Lester Young played in a way that seemed to defy the prevailing fashion, while other tenor players followed the example of Coleman Hawkins, using a big, robust tone and playing harmonically dense solos filled with arpeggios and chord tones. Young played with a lighter, airier sound, emphasizing melody and storytelling, floating phrases that seemed to sing, to speak in complete sentences, and his influence would echo forward through decades, shaping players who came generations later. Meanwhile, in New York, jazz was becoming more sophisticated, more arranged. Duke Ellington, a pianist and composer from Washington, D.C., arrived in the mid-1920s and began building what would become one of the most important orchestras in music history. Ellington understood that jazz could be both popular entertainment and serious art, that it could make people dance and also challenge their ears with complex harmonies and extended forms, The Ellington Orchestra at the Cotton Club, that famous Harlem nightclub where black performers entertained white audiences in a troubling echo of plantation dynamics, nevertheless created music of startling beauty and innovation. Ellington wrote for his specific musicians, crafting parts that showcased their individual sounds and personalities, creating a collective voice that was instantly recognizable, using the orchestra as a painter uses a palette, blending colors and textures to create effects that had never been heard before. Pieces like Mood Indigo, with its unusual instrumentation and haunting melody, or Black and Tan Fantasy, which combined blues feeling with compositional sophistication, showed that jazz could achieve artistic heights while remaining grounded in the dance halls and the lived experience of black Americans. Ellington's music never lost touch with the blues, with the church, with the full spectrum of black musical expression, even as it reached towards something that might be called symphonic. The 1930s brought the swing era, when jazz became America's popular music. Big bands proliferated, their music flooding out of radios and jukeboxes, filling ballrooms and dance halls across the country. The music had grown from small ensembles to orchestras of 15 or more players, arranged with precision but still leaving room for hot solos that could ignite a crowd. Benny Goodman, a white clarinetist from Chicago, became known as the King of Swing, though the title overlooked the many black band leaders like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Jimmy Lunsford, and Chick Webb, who had been playing swing for years. Goodman's success, including his famous 1938 concert at Carnegie Hall, helped bring jazz to mainstream white audiences, and to his credit, Goodman was among the first white band leaders to integrate his groups, hiring black musicians like Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton despite the resistance he faced. The swing era represented jazz's greatest commercial success, but also a certain tension as the music became more arranged, more polished, more accessible. Some worried it was losing the raw spontaneity, the improvisational daring that had defined its early years. The big bands played written arrangements with soloists given specific choruses to shine, but the overall structure was controlled, organized, designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. Still, within these constraints, extraordinary artistry flourished. Billie Holiday, a singer from Philadelphia who had grown up in hardship, brought to jazz vocals an approach that treated the voice as an instrument. She didn't just sing the melody. She reimagined it, bending time, hanging behind the beat or rushing ahead, choosing to emphasize unexpected words, finding meaning in a lyric that might have seemed straightforward on the page. Her voice was not technically perfect by classical standards, but it was perfect for jazz, intimate, vulnerable, utterly authentic. Holiday's recordings with Lester Young, particularly in the late 1930s, represent a kind of musical telepathy. The two artists seemed to understand each other completely. Young's tenor saxophone wrapping around Holiday's voice like a conversation between old friends, each one responding to the other's phrases, creating a whole greater than the sum of its parts. These recordings remain touchstones, examples of jazz at its most lyrical and emotionally direct. The big band era also saw the rise of the virtuoso soloists who could captivate audiences with technical displays that nevertheless remained grounded in emotional expression. Roy Eldridge on trumpet, extending the vocabulary that Armstrong had established. playing with a fierce intensity and harmonic daring that pointed toward what was coming. Art Tatum on piano, whose technique was so advanced that classical pianists stood in awe, yet who used that technique in service of jazz, reimagining standards with harmonic substitutions and rhythmic complexity that seemed impossible, redefining what was possible on the instrument. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, jazz stood at a crossroads. It had become enormously popular, a true American art form that had conquered the world. European musicians were playing jazz. Asian audiences were hungry for it. The music born in the streets of New Orleans was now global, but some musicians felt constrained by the conventions of swing, hungry for new challenges, new ways of expressing themselves through this music that had always been about innovation, about saying something that had never been said before. In the small clubs of Harlem, after hours when the big band gigs were finished, young musicians were gathering to experiment, to push against the boundaries of what jazz had become. Places like Minton's Playhouse and Monroe's Uptown House became laboratories, where players like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, and Kenny Clarke were reimagining the music from the ground up. They called it bebop, or just bop, and it represented a revolution. These musicians took the harmonic structures of swing-era standards, the chord progressions of songs everyone knew, but played them at breakneck tempos with melodies so angular and harmonically complex that dancers stopped trying to follow. This wasn't music for dancing anymore. This was music for listening, for concentrating, for appreciating the sheer artistry and intellectual rigor of what was being created in real time. Charlie Parker, a saxophonist from Kansas City who had woodshedded relentlessly after being humiliated at a jam session as a teenager, emerged as bebop's greatest improviser. His solos were torrents of eighth notes and 16th notes, navigating chord changes with such speed and harmonic sophistication that other musicians struggled to follow. Yet everything he played swung, everything had logic and coherence, musical sentences that built on each other, told stories, even at tempos that seemed to defy human capability. Parker's tone on alto saxophone was bright and cutting, instantly recognizable, and his melodic imagination seemed boundless. He could play a standard like Cherokee and extract from its changes ideas that no one had heard before, transforming familiar material into something utterly new. His recordings from the mid-1940s, pieces like Coco and Ornithology, remain astounding documents of a mind working at the absolute peak of creative possibility. Dizzy Gillespie, a trumpeter from South Carolina with technical command that rivaled anyone who had ever played the instrument, was bebop's other founding genius. His playing featured complex rhythmic accents, harmonic extensions that reached into the upper partials of chords, and a sense of joy and humor that balanced Parker's more troubled intensity. Gillespie was also a skilled composer and arranger, writing pieces like A Night in Tunisia and Salt Peanuts that became bebop standards, expanding the music's repertoire beyond the swing-era songbook. Thelonious Monk, a pianist and composer whose angular melodies and unconventional harmonic choices initially puzzled many listeners, was creating music that seemed to exist in its own universe. His compositions like Round Midnight, Straight No Chaser, and Blue Monk had a logic all their own. Melodies that landed on unexpected notes, rhythms that seemed to pause and stutter in ways that made perfect sense once you adjusted to Monk's vision. He played the piano with a percussive attack, using space and silence as compositional elements, creating music that was both deeply rooted in blues and stride piano tradition and completely original. The bebop revolution was not universally welcomed. Older musicians and critics sometimes dismissed it as musical showing off, as the abandonment of jazz's dance roots and popular appeal. Louis Armstrong, whose own innovations had once been considered radical, famously criticized bebop as confused and pretentious. The music split jazz audiences, creating a divide between those who wanted jazz to remain accessible and entertaining and those who believed it should evolve as a serious art form worthy of concentrated attention. But bebop's influence proved irresistible. Younger musicians absorbed its lessons, learned its language, and by the late 1940s, bebop had become the lingua franca of modern jazz. You couldn't be considered a serious player without mastering its complex harmonic vocabulary and rhythmic sophistication. The music had raised the bar, demanding technical proficiency and theoretical knowledge that previous generations hadn't required. The 1950s brought new developments, new subgenres branching from bebop's tree. Cool jazz emerged on the West Coast, a more relaxed, understated approach championed by players like Miles Davis, whose 1949 Birth of the Cool sessions featured arrangements by Gil Evans that used unusual instrumentation and favored subtlety over aggressive virtuosity. This music breathed, it used space, it suggested rather than declared. Hard bop developed as a response, particularly among East Coast players who felt cool jazz had drained away too much of jazz's blues feeling and emotional intensity. Musicians like Art Blakey, Horace Silver, and Clifford Brown created a music that maintained bebop's harmonic sophistication, but reintegrated gospel and blues influences, creating a sound that was both cerebral and deeply soulful. Music that could make you think and make you feel in equal measure. Miles Davis continued to evolve, becoming one of jazz's most important catalysts for change. His 1959 album Kind of Blue pioneered modal jazz, moving away from bebop's rapid chord changes to an approach based on scales or modes, giving improvisers vast harmonic landscapes to explore. The album featured extraordinary players: John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, Bill Evans on piano, Cannonball Adderley on alto saxophone, Paul Chambers on bass, Jimmy Cobb on drums, and the music they created together possessed a timeless quality, spacious and meditative, some of the most beautiful improvisation ever recorded. John Coltrane, who had played with both Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis, emerged as a titanic force in his own right. His early work demonstrated incredible technical facility, playing what critics called sheets of sound, dense cascades of notes that seemed to explore every possible permutation of a chord. But as the 1960s progressed, Coltrane's music became increasingly spiritual, increasingly searching. Albums like A Love Supreme represented jazz as a form of prayer, of transcendence, of reaching toward the divine through sound. The 1960s brought upheaval to jazz as to everything else in American life. The civil rights movement was reshaping the country, raising questions about art and politics, about who got to define culture, about whether black artists should continue working within European-derived forms or forge something entirely new. And jazz, always responsive to the social conditions from which it emerged, reflected these tensions. Free jazz, or avant-garde jazz, pushed against all the remaining conventions. Musicians like Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, and Albert Ayler abandoned standard chord progressions, traditional song forms, sometimes even conventional technique, seeking a music of pure expression, of emotional directness unmediated by harmonic structures that had originated in European classical music. Coleman's 1960 album Free Jazz featured a double quartet improvising collectively for nearly 40 minutes, creating sound that was raw, chaotic, exhilarating, and polarizing. This period saw jazz fragmenting, moving in multiple directions simultaneously. While Coltrane and Coleman were exploring the outer reaches of abstraction, other musicians were incorporating elements of soul and funk, creating what would become jazz fusion. Miles Davis, ever the innovator, released Bitches Brew in 1970, an album that used electric instruments, rock rhythms, and studio effects to create a sound that outraged jazz purists, but opened new possibilities, new audiences. The 1970s and 80s saw jazz move further from the mainstream of popular music, as rock and then disco and then hip-hop captured the youth audience that had once belonged to jazz. The music became more of a niche interest, kept alive by dedicated musicians, by university jazz programs, by a smaller but devoted audience that appreciated its complexity and artistic ambition. Yet jazz continued to evolve, to absorb influences, to reinvent itself. Musicians like Herbie Hancock embraced synthesizers and funk grooves, creating music that was simultaneously commercial and adventurous. Keith Jarrett explored solo piano improvisation, creating extended spontaneous compositions that drew on jazz, classical music, and folk traditions. Pat Metheny brought a lyrical sensibility to jazz guitar, incorporating influences from Brazilian music and progressive rock. The 1980s saw a turn toward tradition. Young musicians like Wynton Marsalis championed a return to acoustic jazz, to the bebop and hard bop traditions, arguing that jazz had lost its way in the fusion era. This neo-traditional movement brought renewed attention to jazz's history, to its roots, but also sparked debates about whether jazz should primarily preserve its past or continue evolving, whether reverence for tradition might become a prison rather than a foundation. The decades that followed saw jazz become a global language, musicians from every continent interpreting and transforming the tradition. Scandinavian players brought their folk melodies and harmonic sensibilities. Japanese musicians combined jazz with traditional instruments and aesthetics. Cuban and Brazilian artists had long since created their own jazz dialects, demonstrating that this music born in New Orleans had become something larger, a worldwide conversation, a set of principles and practices that could accommodate infinite variation. And through all these changes, through bebop and cool and hard bop and modal and free and fusion and neo-traditional, through every revolution and counter-revolution, certain essential elements persisted: the centrality of improvisation, the conversation between musicians, the blues feeling that could surface even in the most abstract explorations, the swing, that quality of rhythm that makes the music feel alive, breathing, human. Jazz in the 21st century exists in a different cultural landscape than the music that emerged in New Orleans over a century ago. It's no longer America's popular music, no longer the soundtrack to Saturday night dances, but it endures, taught in conservatories, performed in concert halls and festivals, still evolving as contemporary artists like Kamasi Washington, Esperanza Spalding, and Robert Glasper draw on hip-hop, electronic music, and global influences, creating music that honors the tradition while refusing to be bound by it. The music contains multitudes now, a history so rich and varied that no single narrative can encompass it. But perhaps that's fitting for an art form that has always been about individual voices coming together, about finding unity in diversity, about the miracle that occurs when musicians listen deeply to each other and create something that has never existed before and will never exist again in quite the same way. And so we arrive at a question that has no single answer. What is it about this music, this art form born from suffering and joy intertwined, that has endured for more than a century, that has spread across every continent, that continues to speak to something essential in the human experience? Perhaps it begins with the act of improvisation itself, that leap into the unknown that every jazz musician takes when they step forward to solo. There's something profoundly human about creating in real time, about making decisions in the moment with no safety net, no ability to erase and revise, just the courage to play the next note and trust that it will lead somewhere meaningful. In this way, jazz mirrors life itself. We don't get to rehearse our days, to try different versions and choose the best one. We simply move forward, responding to what comes, making choices based on intuition and experience and hope. And sometimes we surprise ourselves. Sometimes we find beauty we didn't know we were capable of creating. Sometimes we stumble, but we keep going. We keep playing. The conversation at the heart of jazz, the way musicians listen and respond to each other, offers a model for how humans might interact more broadly. There's a generosity required, a willingness to support another's moment in the spotlight, to provide the right harmonic or rhythmic foundation for their expression. And there's also the knowledge that your turn will come, that you too will be heard, will be supported in your own voice. This balance between individual and collective, between assertion and accommodation, between standing out and fitting in, jazz negotiates this territory with a grace that feels instructive. The best jazz groups achieve something like democracy in action. Each voice matters. Each contribution shapes the whole. And yet the music doesn't descend into chaos. Instead, it achieves a kind of organic order, a structure that emerges from collaboration rather than being imposed from above. The blues, that foundation upon which so much jazz is built, carries within it a profound wisdom about the human condition, the acknowledgement that life contains suffering, disappointment, heartbreak, but the refusal to be defeated by these realities, instead transforming them into something beautiful, something that can be shared, something that connects us in our common struggles and our common humanity. When Billie Holiday sings of strange fruit hanging from southern trees, she transmutes unspeakable horror into art, bearing witness, refusing to let these crimes be forgotten. And when Louis Armstrong plays West End blues, he takes the sorrow implicit in the blues form and elevates it to something transcendent, something that acknowledges pain but also insists on joy, on the persistence of beauty even in a broken world. Jazz has always been about transformation, taking the materials at hand, often limited materials, sometimes instruments that were cast-offs or second-hand, and creating something precious, something that could not have been created with better resources. This is a kind of alchemy, the transformation of limitation into creativity, of constraint into innovation. The music's relationship to time feels particularly profound. The way jazz musicians inhabit rhythm, stretching and compressing it, playing behind the beat or ahead of it, creating tension and release through their placement of notes in time. This is time made elastic, made human, freed from the mechanical tick of the metronome to become something more fluid, more responsive to feeling and intention. And there's the swing itself, that quality that defies easy definition. You can't notate swing precisely, can't reduce it to a formula. Musicians speak of it in mystical terms. You either have it or you don't. It's a feeling, a way of moving through time that makes the music breathe, that gives it life. And perhaps this ineffable quality is part of jazz's power, the reminder that not everything can be quantified or explained, that some truths can only be felt. The history of jazz runs parallel to the history of black struggle and triumph in America, from its origins in slavery and its aftermath, through Jim Crow and the Great Migration, through the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. The music has been both a refuge and a weapon, a way to maintain dignity in the face of degradation, a way to assert humanity when it was being denied, and a way to achieve excellence so undeniable that even hostile audiences had to acknowledge it. Duke Ellington's insistence that his music was beyond category, that it couldn't be reduced to simple definitions or classifications, was itself a political statement, a refusal to be limited by others' expectations, by the categories and boxes that American racism tried to impose. His music was sophisticated, complex, beautiful, and unapologetically black, demonstrating that these qualities were not contradictory but complementary. The global reach of jazz, the way it has been adopted and adapted by musicians from Tokyo to Stockholm to Johannesburg, speaks to something universal in its language. Despite emerging from a very specific cultural context, from the particular experience of African Americans, the music contains within it principles and practices that translate across cultures. The emphasis on individual expression within collective creation, the value placed on innovation and originality, the celebration of technical mastery in service of emotional truth. And yet, for all its global influence, jazz remains deeply connected to its roots, to the blues and spirituals, to the work songs and ring shouts, to the African rhythmic complexity and the call and response patterns. These connections persist even in the most abstract contemporary jazz, like deep roots that nourish the tree no matter how far its branches extend. The lineage matters in jazz, the way knowledge passes from one generation to the next, not just through formal education, though that has become important, but through the older tradition of mentorship, of young musicians learning by listening, by sitting in, by absorbing the wisdom of elders who have walked the path before them. This creates a living tradition, a chain of influence stretching back to those early days in New Orleans and forward into an unknown future. There's something moving about the fact that musicians today can still listen to recordings of Charlie Parker or Billie Holiday or Louis Armstrong, can study their phrasing and their choices, can learn from artists who have been gone for decades. The recordings become a kind of immortality, a way for the music to persist beyond the fleeting moments of its creation. And yet recordings can never fully capture the live experience, the energy in the room, the unique interaction between musicians and audience in a specific moment that will never return. Perhaps that's appropriate for a music so fundamentally about presence, about being fully engaged in the current moment, about the impossibility of stepping in the same river twice. Every performance is different. Every solo takes a new path. And this impermanence, this acceptance that beauty can exist briefly and then dissolve, feels like a kind of wisdom, a recognition that everything changes, everything passes. And that's not a tragedy, but simply the nature of existence. As the night deepens, as this long journey through jazz history winds toward its end, I find myself thinking about all the musicians who created this art form, those who became famous and those whose names are lost to history, the ones who recorded prolifically and the ones who played only in local clubs, never documented, never celebrated beyond their immediate community. Each one contributed something, each voice added to the great conversation, and the music we have today, in all its diversity and complexity, is built on their collective effort, their dedication to an art form that rarely made them rich, that often subjected them to indignity and discrimination, but that gave them a way to speak truth, to create beauty, to connect with others across the barriers that society erected. The music continues. New musicians discovering jazz every day, bringing their own experiences and influences, their own questions and concerns, finding in this tradition room for their voices, their stories, proof that jazz remains vital, remains relevant, remains capable of expressing the full range of human feeling and thought in the small clubs and concert halls, in basement jam sessions and university practice rooms, in bedroom studios where young producers sample old records, creating new contexts for familiar sounds. The conversation continues, the tradition evolves, the music breathes and changes and persists. There's a recording of John Coltrane near the end of his life, Gihigi, playing with an intensity that seems to transcend the physical, reaching for something beyond language, beyond conventional musical expression. And you can hear in those sounds a longing, a searching, a refusal to settle for easy answers or comfortable formulas, a commitment to pushing further, digging deeper, seeking truth through sound. That spirit, that restless creative energy, that insistence on honesty and innovation runs through jazz history like a golden thread, connecting Buddy Bolden to Charlie Parker, to John Coltrane, to the musicians playing tonight in cities around the world, each generation receiving the tradition and transforming it, honoring the past by refusing to merely repeat it. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson jazz offers, that tradition and innovation need not be opposites, that you can respect what came before while insisting on your right to say something new, that the most profound way to honor your ancestors is not to imitate them, but to embody their spirit of courage and creativity in your own unique voice. The music asks difficult things of us. It asks us to listen deeply, to embrace complexity, to find beauty in unexpected places, to accept that perfection might matter less than authenticity, that the supposedly wrong note played with conviction and feeling might be more truthful than the technically correct one played without soul. As this story fades, as the final notes drift into silence, the music itself continues somewhere, always, in recordings and in live performances, in the minds of musicians practicing their craft, in the hearts of listeners who have found in jazz a companion, a comfort, a challenge, a mirror reflecting their own complexity back to them. The river keeps flowing, carrying new currents, new tributaries joining the mainstream, but always recognizing itself, always jazz, always that conversation between musicians, that transformation of limitation into art, that insistence on swing and soul and the blues, that celebration of individual voices creating collective beauty. And in the quiet that follows, in the space after the last note has faded, something lingers, a feeling, a memory, the echo of all those voices, all those instruments, all those nights when music transformed a room, transformed the people in it, created a moment of transcendence that existed briefly and then dissolved, leaving only the memory and the certainty that somewhere, tonight, it's happening again, the miracle of jazz, being born anew. The story rests here, in this stillness, in this silence that contains all the music that has been and all the music yet to come, waiting, patient, eternal as the night itself.